So the pandemic response and the role of the federal government, the premiers and the election timing issue again front and center in the federal election campaign today. The crisis in Alberta sending waves through the campaign today. Let's debate the latest developments with three candidates. Jennifer O'Connell is the Liberal candidate for re-election in the Ontario riding of Pickering-Uxbridge. Michael Barrett is the Conservative candidate for re-election in the Ontario riding of Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands and Rideau Lakes. And Heather McPherson is the NDP candidate for re-election in the riding of Edmonton, Strathcona. It's good to see you all. Heather McPherson, let me start with you if I can. The Alberta COVID crisis now center stage in the federal election campaign today. You're in the middle of the crisis out there in Alberta. Your leader, Jagmeet Singh, says an NDP government in Ottawa would consider all tools available to end the crisis. But what specifically would an NDP government be doing differently?
Oh my God. I mean, there's so many things that we should have done to not be in this situation. You know, this doesn't come as a surprise to healthcare workers. It doesn't come as a surprise to any Albertans. This really, you know, we saw this coming. I called for an emergency debate in the spring because we had seen already the disastrous job that Jason Kenney was doing in Alberta with COVID-19. But what we would be doing is we would not be calling a pandemic election. I can tell you that. We would not be standing against sick time for workers. We would be getting some support for the healthcare workers. I asked the Prime Minister and the Minister of Health days before the election to actually work directly with the healthcare workers and with teachers and educators to protect Albertans, because we saw the writing on the wall that Jason Kenney wasn't going to do it.
Okay, we'll come back. Let me move to your colleagues here, and we'll continue our discussion. Mr. Barrett, your leader, Aaron O'Toole, has repeatedly said that Jason Kenney is managing the pandemic better than Justin Trudeau, but repeatedly today he was asked if he still believes that's true, and he refused to answer. So let me ask you, which of those two leaders, Jason Kenney or Justin Trudeau, is doing a better job of managing the pandemic?
I think that we find ourselves in a terrible position as a country. With at the beginning of the Delta-driven fourth wave, we're into, frankly, a vanity election that called at a time solely of the Prime Minister's choosing, when all parliamentarians had said it was not the time to have an election. It's going to cost us $600 million this election. Think about what that money could do to help healthcare capacity in provinces like Alberta or here in my home province.
Do you think Jason Kenney's done a good job of managing the pandemic?
I think that a Conservative government is going to work with a premier of any political stripe to make sure that they have all of the resources that they need to deal with COVID-19 and health and future public health crises. We find ourselves in a worse position than we ought to have been in, with a government that's mismanaged this pandemic, slow to close borders, gave mixed messaging on masking, and then when it was time to pick a dance partner for vaccine manufacturing and procurement, picked the Chinese communist CanSino instead of partnering with a pharmaceutical company domestically or in a neighboring democracy. So we've seen a lot of really bad missteps from Mr. Trudeau, not the least of which is calling the election that we're in right now.
All right, Jennifer O'Connell, let me turn to you. Justin Trudeau said today he doesn't want to judge Alberta's pandemic response, but then went on to say leadership matters, which is effectively judging the response, and saying Conservative politicians across this country haven't been as effective in fighting this pandemic. Yet the experts predicted the fourth wave would get worse, but Justin Trudeau called an election anyway. So how is that the right pandemic leadership?
Well, I think the leadership that Justin Trudeau is showing is that Canadians need to see Conservatives for what they are in how they have been reacting to this pandemic, which is all politics. Look at the mudslinging you just saw from Mr. Barrett. There was no substance there. But what this is about is Justin Trudeau has been standing up against anti-vaxxers, even as they hurl stones and insults at him, because he is fighting for Canadians to finish the fight against the pandemic. And he is standing up because he knows that the way we get through this pandemic is through vaccinations.
But hang on a second. Would any of that be happening on the campaign trail if it wouldn't be happening? You wouldn't be in an election.
But this is precisely what Conservatives tried to do in Parliament. For example, Mr. Barrett spoke about financing. Well, it was the Conservatives that actually voted against $5 billion in Budget 2021 that would support provinces and territories for surges in their hospitals. So this is what we're taking to the electorate. Do you want Conservatives who don't support Canadians through this pandemic and instead are playing politics? The Conservatives and the NDP had no problem campaigning in provincial elections.
Jennifer,
Mr. O'Toole had no problem going to the Calgary Stampede when all COVID restrictions were lifted. And now when Canadians need leadership most, they're absent.
We're all going to get a chance here.
Mr. Trudeau sat on a stage with the Premier of Alberta, excitedly discussing the Calgary Stampede. This is the worst kind of revisionist history that we're seeing, and a complete absence of leadership from Mr. Trudeau and from his spokesperson.
We have, look, to be clear, we've seen all the leaders traveling to different parts of Canada, less than we would see in a non-pandemic election, but it's been happening. So everybody's been traveling. Heather McPherson, so your leader said today, Mr. Singh, that he did condemn the election call. Both he condemned Mr. Kenney's leadership and Justin Trudeau's leadership. Said MPs should be back in Ottawa. Should never been an election. So if you were back in Ottawa debating things, what difference would that make? Parliament was sitting and debating the whole time during the pandemic when Jason Kenney was making decisions about how to deal with the pandemic. So what difference would it make if you were still sitting in Ottawa debating?
Well, I mean, honestly, we had an emergency debate in the House of Commons because we wanted to look at what Jason Kenney was doing in Alberta in the spring. It's worse now. We have heard both my colleagues have said, no, you guys liked Jason Kenney the most. Like, seriously, your bickering back and forth is hurting Albertans. Albertans are dying right now. Our healthcare system is in free fall. Your parties haven't even sent an Alberta representative to be on this call to talk about what's happening in Alberta. Where are the other 33 members of Parliament that aren't showing up? Why are they not standing up for Albertans? Why are they not here? Why are we not talking about this right now? Like I said to you earlier, I wrote to the Prime Minister and the Minister of Health and asked them to work directly with the province because we saw the writing on the wall in July. And instead of actually doing that work, instead of working with me, I'm happy to work with anyone who will work with Albertans. They decided to call an election. So we don't have the tools we can right now to help Alberta and to help our healthcare system and our
Mr.
Barrett,
Mr. Barrett, we find ourselves where we find ourselves, and that's in the middle of a federal election campaign. And now, clearly, there are comparisons being made today, points of differentiation between pandemic leadership, whether it's Jason Kenney's today and Justin Trudeau's. And so, Canadians want to know if Conservatives were to form government next week, which pandemic approach do you like better? Is it what you've seen from Justin Trudeau or the pandemic approach you've seen from Jason Kenney? What can Canadians expect from a Conservative government?
Canada's Conservatives have put forward a really exciting plan to really restore Canadians' confidence in our healthcare system, including massive increases in healthcare spending. The First Ministers met with the Prime Minister and had one unified ask. That was more healthcare spending. Mr. Trudeau said that had happened after the pandemic. We're prepared to do it right now. We're going to reinvest in Canada's emergency stockpile. We're going to reinvest in Canada's domestic vaccine production capacity. We're also going to make sure that we're taking seriously Canada's early pandemic warning system, which was switched off and disregarded at the worst possible time by Mr. Trudeau. So there are a suite of things that we're going to do, not the least of which is increased healthcare funding for all provinces, of course, including Alberta. And I'd just like to remind everyone that the $600 million we're spending on this election would go a long way to serve the interests of course, Albertans, but Canadians from coast to coast to coast. And that's exactly the difference of leadership that you'd see under a Conservative government with Prime Minister Aaron O'Toole versus the absence of leadership we've seen with Mr. Trudeau.
Jennifer O'Connell, there are people again asking today about the powers of a federal government to step in and take action. Jason Kenney's got problems. Maybe that will reflect on Aaron O'Toole, but as we've talked about, Justin Trudeau is still getting heat for calling a pandemic election. If some provincial leadership on the pandemic has been so bad, as was suggested by the Prime Minister today, why didn't the Prime Minister use his federal powers to step in and deliver a more effective response?
Well, I think we've seen throughout the course of this pandemic, the federal government has been there for all provinces and territories when they need it. And again today, Justin Trudeau announced that we would be there for Albertans and we will do whatever it takes to help. But I think what's really important.
But is it the right approach to say, look, we're going to stand back and watch you take the actions you take to manage the pandemic, and if you make a mess of things, we'll do what we can to help you, but we won't stop you from making a mess of things?
Well, I mean, this is a question that every premier across this country has a responsibility and a duty to their citizens, and we have been working with all of them. We have been encouraging people to step up and get vaccinated. We have provided funds to provinces and territories to implement those vaccine certifications. But I think the important point throughout all of this is that 4 days ago, Erin O'Toole was praising Premier Kenney's approach to the pandemic, despite scientists and experts saying it was wrong. We have been standing up saying that you need to follow the public health measures.
We heard that. Okay,
and today,
listen, we only
Erin O'Toole
we got 15 seconds left, and in
name.
fairness, I just want to, Heather McPherson, let me ask you this. So you're in Alberta. So should the federal government have used, or should it be using now, should it be considering emergency powers to step in to take over the pandemic response or to change the pandemic response in Alberta?
They need to be stepping in and helping us with passports, vaccine passports. They need to be making sure that our healthcare system does not absolutely crumble and fail. You know, we are already looking for healthcare workers from around the province or the country. We are already looking to send people to ICUs in other provinces.
That's sending in help. Should the government invoke emergency powers and say, look, it's time for us to step in? And
I think we need to. Alberta needs it. Alberta doctors and healthcare workers need it right now. It's really, really dire here. It is not the time for an election, and Jason Kenney and the Conservative government he leads has completely failed Albertans. All
right, we'll have to leave. We're out of time. We'll have a chance to talk again, but thank you all for your time today. Appreciate all of your input on this, and we'll talk again soon. Good luck to all of you. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.